The night my marriage ended, the rain would not stop falling. It tapped against the windows of our quiet suburban home like a reminder that something had gone terribly wrong. I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at a stack of divorce papers that had arrived just hours earlier. The house that once felt full of laughter now echoed with silence. On the table beside those papers was a wedding photo turned face down, as if even the memory of that day could not bear to look at what our lives had become. The night my marriage ended, I believed my wife had betrayed me. I believed she had lied to me, deceived me, and chosen someone else over the man she once promised to love for the rest of her life. But the truth I would later discover was far worse than betrayal. The person who destroyed my marriage was not my wife. It was the man I trusted more than anyone in the world, my best friend. For most of my life, I believed loyalty was something that could not be broken between two people who had grown up side by side. When you share childhood memories, secrets, victories, and failures with someone, you begin to think of them as more than a friend. They become family. That was exactly who Ryan Parker was to me. Ryan and I had known each other since we were kids growing up in a quiet town in Ohio. Our parents knew each other. We played baseball together in the same dusty field every summer. We celebrated birthdays together, got into trouble together, and even dreamed about the kind of lives we wanted to build when we finally became adults. If someone had asked me back then who I trusted the most in this world, I would have answered without hesitation. Ryan Parker. As we got older, our lives followed different paths, but our friendship never faded. I eventually moved to a suburb outside Chicago where I started working as a project manager for a construction company. Ryan stayed closer to our hometown for a while before later moving to the same city. Even though we were both busy building careers and adult responsibilities, we stayed close. Ryan was the kind of friend who showed up when it mattered. When my father passed away, he drove 6 hours just to stand beside me at the funeral. When I bought my first house, he spent an entire weekend helping me paint walls and move furniture. When I struggled through a difficult time in my 20s, he was the one who reminded me that life eventually gets better. That kind of loyalty is rare, and because of that, I never once questioned the place Ryan held in my life. Then one evening, everything changed when I met the woman who would eventually become my wife. Her name was Emily Carter. We met at a mutual friend's birthday dinner in downtown Chicago. Emily had a calm confidence about her that made people feel comfortable the moment she spoke. She was thoughtful, intelligent, and had a sense of humor that made even ordinary conversations feel interesting. We talked for nearly 2 hours that night about everything from travel dreams to childhood memories. By the time the evening ended, I already felt something I had not experienced in years: hope. A few weeks later, we went on our first real date, and from that moment forward our relationship moved quickly. Within a year we were engaged, and soon after that we were standing in front of our families and friends promising to build a life together. Ryan stood beside me at that wedding as my best man. I still remember looking over at him during the ceremony and feeling grateful that the person who had shared so many years of my life was standing there on one of the most important days I would ever experience. After the wedding, Ryan gave a speech that made everyone laugh and even brought Emily to tears. He talked about our childhood adventures and how proud he was to see me start a new chapter of my life. When he finished, he hugged me and said something I will never forget. He said, "You deserve this happiness, man. I'm really glad you found someone like Emily." At the time, those words felt genuine. I had no reason to believe otherwise. The first year of marriage felt exactly the way people hope marriage will feel. Emily and I built routines together that slowly turned our house into a home. Sunday mornings meant coffee on the back porch. And by the time I finally discovered what he had done, it was already too late. The truth behind those anonymous messages would eventually reveal something I never imagined possible. Because the person who sent them was not a stranger. It was not someone who disliked me from a distance. It was someone who sat at my dinner table, laughed in my living room, and stood beside me on my wedding day. The man who slowly destroyed my marriage was Ryan Parker, my best friend. And once I began uncovering the evidence that proved it, I realized that the betrayal had started long before my marriage ever began. When people hear a story about betrayal, they often imagine strangers, enemies, or people who barely knew each other. But this story is different, because the three people at the center of it once shared something that looked unbreakable. If you were to open an old photo album from those years, you would see smiling faces, backyard gatherings, and the kind of moments that look ordinary until time reveals what was really happening underneath them. There are pictures of summer barbecues where laughter fills the air and friends sit around a wooden table with plates of food and cold drinks. In many of those photos, three people appear together again and again. Mark Reynolds, the man who believed he had built a stable life with the woman he loved. Sarah Carter, the woman who stood beside him on their wedding day promising a future together. And Daniel Carter, the man standing beside Mark not only as his closest friend but also as the best man at that wedding. For more than 20 years, Mark Reynolds and Daniel Carter had been inseparable. Their friendship had survived childhood fights, teenage mistakes, and the long road into adulthood. When people described them, they often used the same phrase. They said those two were like brothers. Mark trusted Daniel with the kind of loyalty that rarely fades. When one of them needed help, the other showed up without hesitation. When one celebrated success, the other celebrated just as proudly. Their lives had become so connected that it was almost impossible to imagine one without the other somewhere close by. That was why no one questioned it when Daniel became part of nearly every major moment in Mark's life. When Mark met Sarah Carter, Daniel was one of the first people to hear about her. Mark still remembered the evening he called Daniel after their first real date. He described Sarah as someone different from anyone he had met before. She was thoughtful, warm, and easy to talk to. She listened when people spoke and had a way of making conversations feel meaningful instead of rushed. Daniel listened carefully while Mark talked about her for nearly an hour that night. By the end of that conversation, Daniel told him something that seemed simple but encouraging. He said it sounded like Mark had finally found someone worth building a life with. That moment felt like the beginning of something positive, the kind of encouragement a best friend gives when he sees happiness coming into another person's life. Over time, Sarah became part of their circle naturally. She joined them at football watch parties, holiday dinners, and casual weekends where friends gathered just to relax after long work weeks. Mark loved how easily she fit into his world. She got along with his friends, she understood his humor, and she respected the bond he shared with Daniel. In fact, Sarah and Daniel developed a friendly connection of their own. They joked with each other during group dinners and occasionally teamed up to tease Mark about small things like his stubborn habits or his loyalty to certain sports teams. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like the perfect dynamic between three people who trusted each other completely. When Mark finally decided to propose to Sarah, Daniel was the first person he told. He even asked Daniel for help choosing the ring. They spent an afternoon visiting jewelry stores, discussing different options, and imagining how the proposal might happen. Daniel seemed genuinely excited about it. When Mark finally asked Sarah to marry him and she said yes, Daniel celebrated the moment as if it were his own victory. A year later, when the wedding day arrived, there was never any question about who would stand beside Mark at the altar. Daniel Carter stood proudly as the best man, smiling in photographs that would later sit framed inside Mark and Sarah's home. During the wedding reception, Daniel gave a speech that guests would talk about long after the night ended. He spoke about growing up with Mark, about childhood memories that made everyone laugh, and about how proud he was to see his closest friend start a new chapter with someone he truly loved. At one point in the speech, he raised his glass and said something that felt sincere and heartfelt. He said that Mark and Sarah were proof that life sometimes brings the right people together at the right time. When he finished speaking, the room filled with applause. Mark hugged him and thanked him for always being there. Sarah hugged him too, grateful that the most important people in their lives could share that moment together. For the first few years after the wedding, life seemed steady and predictable in the best possible way. Mark and Sarah settled into their home, building routines that slowly turned the house into a place full of shared memories. Daniel continued to visit often, sometimes stopping by after work to watch a game or joining them for dinner on weekends. Many evenings ended with the three of them sitting in the living room laughing about stories from the past or debating small topics that friends enjoy arguing about when everyone feels comfortable with each other. If someone had walked into that house during those years, they would have seen nothing unusual. It looked like the kind of friendship and marriage people hope to have in their own lives. But something happened within those first 3 years that no one could have predicted at the time. Slowly, the warmth inside that home began to change. Small disagreements started appearing between Mark and Sarah. At first, they seemed harmless, the kind of misunderstandings every couple experiences occasionally. But the tension grew stronger as time passed. Conversations that once ended in laughter began ending in silence. Questions started appearing that Mark could not fully understand. Sarah began expressing doubts that felt completely unexpected. And before long, the calm life they had built together started to feel fragile in ways Mark could not explain. Within 3 years of their wedding day, the marriage that once looked full of promise collapsed completely. Sarah left their home. Divorce papers arrived on Mark's kitchen table. Friends who once spent weekends together began drifting apart. To outsiders, it looked like a relationship that simply failed the way many relationships do. Some people quietly assumed that Mark must have done something wrong. Others believed Sarah must have fallen out of love. But the truth behind the collapse of that marriage was far more complicated than anyone realized. 3 questions would eventually define the mystery that followed. The first question seemed obvious at the time. Was Sarah hiding something that Mark had not yet discovered? The second question was far more painful for Mark to even consider. Did Daniel, the man he trusted more than anyone else, somehow betray him? And the third question would prove to be the most disturbing of all. Was there something much more manipulative happening behind the scenes that neither Mark nor Sarah had fully understood while their marriage was falling apart? Because what Mark would eventually discover did not happen suddenly. It revealed itself slowly, piece by piece, through messages, conversations, and evidence that forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the people closest to him. The deeper he looked into the events that destroyed his marriage, the clearer one thing became. This was not simply a relationship that failed over time. It was something far more deliberate. The truth waiting at the end of that discovery would expose a betrayal so carefully planned and so deeply personal that it destroyed not only a marriage but also a friendship that had lasted more than 2 decades. And when Mark finally understood what Daniel Carter had done, the life he once believed in would never look the same again. Mark Reynolds was the kind of man people trusted immediately. It was not something he tried to create intentionally. It was simply the way he carried himself. People who met Mark for the first time often described him as steady, the type of person who spoke calmly, listened carefully, and rarely made promises he could not keep. He grew up in a small town where most people knew each other's families, where neighbors waved from their front porches in the evenings, and where reputation mattered more than appearances. Mark's father worked long hours as a mechanic, and his mother worked at a local school. From a young age, Mark learned the value of hard work, responsibility, and loyalty to the people around him. Those lessons stayed with him long after he left that small town behind. As a boy, Mark spent most of his afternoons outdoors. Summers meant dusty baseball fields, bicycles leaning against fences, and long evenings where kids played until the streetlights came on. It was during those years that he met the person who would become the most important friend of his life. Daniel Carter lived only a few houses away, and the two of them quickly formed the kind of friendship that happens naturally between kids who share the same neighborhood and the same curiosity about the world. They played on the same baseball team, sat together in school classes, and spent weekends exploring places around town that felt enormous when they were young. To everyone who knew them back then, Mark Reynolds and Daniel Carter seemed inseparable. Their friendship grew stronger as they moved through their teenage years. High school brought new experiences, new challenges, and the usual mistakes that come with growing up, but Mark and Daniel faced most of it together. When one got into trouble, the other usually found a way to help. When one struggled with something personal, the other was there to listen. There were nights when they sat in Daniel's backyard talking about what life might look like after graduation. They talked about careers they hoped to build, cities they might live in, and the kind of families they imagined someday having. During those conversations, they often joked that no matter where life took them, they would always stay close. At that age, the future felt wide open, and their friendship felt permanent. After high school, their paths shifted slightly, but the connection remained strong. Mark eventually moved to a larger city where he began working in construction. He started at the bottom, learning every part of the job from the ground up. The work was demanding, often starting before sunrise and ending long after most people had left their offices for the day. But Mark never complained about the long hours. He believed that building something meaningful required effort, patience, and discipline. Over time, he gained the respect of coworkers and supervisors because he was dependable and willing to take responsibility when others hesitated. His reputation grew slowly, and before long he had worked his way into a management role overseeing projects and coordinating teams. Even as his career developed, the qualities that defined him never changed. Mark remained loyal, hardworking, and deeply focused on building a stable life. Throughout those years, Daniel Carter remained a constant presence. Daniel had a different personality than Mark, but that difference was part of what made their friendship work. Where Mark was calm and measured, Daniel was outgoing and energetic. He was the type of person who could walk into a crowded room and start conversations with strangers as if he had known them for years. In their younger days, that confidence often made him the center of attention during social gatherings. But despite their differences, Mark trusted Daniel completely. The bond they shared had been tested by time, distance, and the many changes that come with adulthood. When Mark spoke about Daniel to others, he often described him as more than a friend. He described him as a brother. There was even a moment years before Mark ever met Sarah when he said something that now feels like a quiet warning from the past. One evening during a conversation with coworkers, someone asked Mark who he trusted the most in his life. Without hesitation, Mark answered the question. He said that if anything ever happened to him, Daniel Carter would be the person he trusted to handle it. He trusted Daniel with his secrets, his personal struggles, and the decisions that mattered most. To Mark, that level of trust felt natural after decades of shared history. It never crossed his mind that such loyalty could someday be turned against him. Then everything changed the day Mark met Sarah Carter. The meeting itself was simple and unexpected. Mark stopped by a small coffee shop near his office one afternoon during a break between meetings. The place was quiet, the kind of cafe where people worked on laptops or read books while soft music played in the background. Sarah was sitting alone at a table near the window reading something on her tablet. When Mark placed his order at the counter, they ended up exchanging a few casual words about the long line and the unusually cold weather that week. The conversation might have ended there if Sarah had not made a light-hearted comment that made Mark laugh. Something about the moment felt natural, and within minutes they were sitting at the same table talking about work, travel, and the strange ways life brings people together unexpectedly. Sarah Carter had a presence that immediately stood out. She was intelligent without being arrogant, thoughtful without appearing distant, and independent in a way that made it clear she valued her own path in life. She worked in marketing for a technology company and had moved to the city a few years earlier to pursue career opportunities. During that first conversation, Mark noticed how easily she expressed her ideas and how genuinely curious she seemed about the people she met. By the time they finished their coffee, he realized he did not want the conversation to end. Before leaving the cafe, he asked if she would like to meet again sometime. Sarah smiled and agreed. Over the following months, their relationship developed quickly. They explored restaurants around the city, attended concerts, and spent long evenings talking about the kind of future they hoped to build. Mark admired Sarah's determination and the way she balanced ambition with kindness. She admired Mark's reliability and the sense of stability he brought into her life. Their relationship felt balanced, the kind of connection where both people supported each other's goals while building something together. Naturally, as Sarah became a more important part of Mark's life, she also met the person who had been there long before she arrived, Daniel Carter. The first time Sarah met Daniel was during a casual dinner Mark organized with a few friends. Daniel greeted her warmly and quickly started joking with Mark about embarrassing stories from their childhood. Sarah laughed along with the stories and seemed comfortable almost immediately. Over the following weeks, she would occasionally see Daniel when he joined Mark for weekend football games or group dinners. Their interactions were friendly and relaxed. Daniel appeared supportive of Mark's relationship and often spoke positively about how happy Mark seemed since meeting Sarah. From the outside, it looked like the kind of friendship and relationship dynamic people hope to have in their lives. As Mark and Sarah grew closer, Daniel became involved in more of their shared moments. When Mark began thinking about proposing, he naturally turned to Daniel for advice. One evening, the two friends met at a bar not far from Mark's office and talked about the idea for hours. Mark explained how certain he felt about Sarah and how he wanted to build a future with her. Daniel listened carefully before offering encouragement. He told Mark that if he truly loved Sarah, he should not wait too long to take the next step. According to Daniel, some opportunities in life should not be delayed when you know they are right. Those words stayed with Mark long after that conversation ended. In fact, Daniel was the one who encouraged Mark to propose. He even helped him plan how the proposal might happen and offered suggestions about choosing the engagement ring. When Mark finally asked Sarah to marry him and she said yes, Daniel celebrated with genuine enthusiasm. The moment felt like a victory shared by everyone involved. Months later, when wedding plans were finalized, Daniel stood proudly beside Mark as his best man. Photographs from that day show three people smiling together, celebrating the beginning of what looked like a joyful future. At the time, Mark believed his best friend was celebrating his happiness. Every smile, every supportive word, every toast raised during the wedding reception seemed sincere. There was nothing in Daniel's behavior that suggested anything different. But years later, when Mark began looking back at those moments through the lens of what he eventually discovered, the memories started to feel different. Small details that once seemed meaningless began to stand out. Conversations that once felt harmless suddenly carried a different weight. And slowly Mark realized that the story he thought he understood might have been very different from the reality unfolding around him. At the time, Mark had no reason to question anything. He believed he had found the right partner in Sarah and that his closest friend was genuinely happy for him. But as time passed and the events that destroyed his marriage slowly came into focus, one troubling possibility began to surface. The person he trusted most might have been hiding intentions that no one had seen clearly before. And when that possibility finally became impossible to ignore, Mark realized that the friendship he had relied on for most of his life might have been built on something far more complicated than loyalty alone. Life after the wedding settled into a rhythm that felt comfortable and familiar for Mark Reynolds and Sarah Carter. The excitement of the ceremony had faded into everyday routines, but the sense of building a future together remained strong. Their home slowly became the place where friends gathered for dinners, weekend conversations, and long evenings that stretched past midnight. Mark enjoyed hosting those gatherings because they reminded him of the small-town community he had grown up in. Sarah added her own touch to everything, making the house feel warm and welcoming. She often prepared meals for guests, arranging the dining table carefully as if each dinner was a quiet celebration of the life they were building. And almost every time those gatherings happened, Daniel Carter was there too. Daniel had always been a regular presence in Mark's life, so it felt natural that he continued to visit often after the marriage. Some evenings he would stop by after work carrying takeout or snacks for a game night. Other weekends he joined them for barbecues in the backyard, laughing as he and Mark argued over sports teams or old stories from their childhood. Sarah seemed comfortable around him as well. She had grown used to the way Daniel's energy filled the room with conversation. When guests came over, Daniel often helped keep everyone entertained with jokes and stories that made people forget how late the hour had become. Looking back at those early months, it seemed like a simple continuation of the friendship that had existed long before Sarah became part of the picture. There were even group trips that further strengthened that sense of closeness. Once during the summer, Mark and Sarah planned a short vacation with a few friends to a lake house outside the city. Daniel joined them for the trip, bringing along the same lively personality that had defined him for years. They spent the days boating on the water, grilling food on the porch, and talking about everything from childhood memories to future plans. Mark remembered standing by the lake one evening, watching the sun set, while Sarah and Daniel joked with the others on the dock. At that moment, he felt certain that life had reached a point of balance and happiness he had always hoped for. His closest friend and the woman he loved were both part of the same life, sharing the same experiences, and everything appeared to fit together perfectly. Back at home, the routine continued much the same way. Daniel was always around. Sometimes he helped Mark with small house repairs, bringing tools and offering advice whenever something needed fixing. If a shelf had to be installed or a leaky faucet needed attention, Daniel volunteered without being asked. Other times he simply came over to watch football games with Mark in the living room while Sarah prepared dinner in the kitchen. On evenings when Mark worked late at the construction site, Daniel occasionally stopped by the house to drop something off or check in. Mark saw this as a sign of loyalty. To him, it meant his friends still cared about being part of his life even as responsibilities and careers kept everyone busy. For a while, everything seemed completely normal. Mark believed he had achieved the kind of life many people spend years trying to build. A stable job, a loving partner, and a trusted friend who had stood beside him through nearly every stage of his life. But as time passed, small changes began to appear inside the house that Mark could not immediately explain. At first, they were so subtle that he ignored them. Sarah occasionally seemed distracted during conversations, as if something was on her mind that she had not yet decided to share. Sometimes she would pause in the middle of a discussion and ask questions that felt slightly out of place. Mark assumed she was dealing with stress from work or adjusting to the demands of married life. Everyone experiences moments like that, and he saw no reason to treat them as anything serious. But the changes did not fade away. Instead, they slowly became more noticeable. One evening during dinner, Sarah asked Mark where he had been after work the previous day. The question itself was not unusual, but the tone of her voice sounded different from the relaxed curiosity he was used to hearing. Mark answered honestly, explaining that he had stayed late at the office finishing reports for an upcoming project. Sarah nodded but did not seem entirely convinced. A few days later, she asked a similar question about another evening when he had returned home later than usual. Again, Mark explained his schedule, assuming the conversation would end there. Instead, Sarah seemed quietly unsettled, as though she believed there was more to the story. Soon the calm atmosphere in their home began to shift. Small disagreements appeared more frequently, often starting with questions that Mark struggled to understand. Sarah sometimes seemed irritated by details that had never caused conflict before. She would bring up minor issues about communication or accuse Mark of being distracted when they talked. Mark tried to reassure her that everything was fine, but the tension continued to grow. During some evenings, they would sit together in the living room without speaking much at all, each of them lost in separate thoughts about something neither fully understood. Then another strange detail entered the picture. Sarah started receiving text messages from a number she did not recognize. At first, the messages appeared harmless, almost like random information sent by mistake. But as more messages arrived, their content began to change. They contained comments suggesting that Mark had been spending time with someone else after work. Some messages mentioned specific locations where Mark had supposedly been seen. Others hinted at conversations he had supposedly had with another woman. When Sarah first showed these messages to Mark, he stared at the screen in complete confusion. None of the accusations matched anything that had actually happened. Mark immediately told her the messages were false, probably sent by someone trying to cause trouble for reasons they did not understand. Sarah wanted to believe him, but doubt had already started to creep into her mind. The messages continued arriving over the following weeks, each one reinforcing the idea that Mark might be hiding something from her. Mark insisted that he had never been unfaithful and that the accusations were simply lies created by someone who wanted to break their trust. But proving that truth became increasingly difficult because the messages included details that made the accusations seem believable. Mark could not understand how anyone would have enough information about his daily schedule to create such convincing stories. The situation left both of them frustrated and confused. At first, Mark blamed stress for the growing tension between them. Work had been demanding for both of them, and he assumed the strange messages were simply adding unnecessary pressure to their relationship. He believed that if they ignored the messages long enough, the person sending them would eventually stop. For a short time, it seemed like that might happen. The messages slowed down, and a few quiet weeks passed where Mark and Sarah tried to return to their normal routine. But the calm did not last. When the messages returned, they arrived with greater intensity than before, and the arguments inside their home became harder to control. What began as occasional disagreements turned into full arguments that left both of them emotionally exhausted. Sarah questioned Mark's honesty with increasing frustration, while Mark struggled to understand why someone would go to such lengths to interfere in their marriage. Each conversation ended the same way, with neither of them satisfied by the answers they had received. Slowly, the trust that had once defined their relationship began to weaken. Then one night, the tension reached a point that Mark would never forget. The argument started suddenly, sparked by another message that had appeared on Sarah's phone earlier that evening. Sarah confronted him with anger and pain in her voice, demanding that he finally admit what he had been hiding. Mark stood there stunned, trying to explain once again that the accusations were lies. But this time Sarah's patience had completely disappeared. In a moment filled with frustration and disbelief, she looked directly at him and said something that changed everything. She accused Mark Reynolds of betraying her with another woman. And the most painful part was that Mark had never done anything wrong. The night Sarah Carter finally said the words out loud, the house felt smaller than it ever had before. The argument had been building for weeks, but neither of them expected it to reach the point it did. Sarah stood in the middle of the living room holding her phone, her hands shaking slightly as she scrolled through a long list of messages on the screen. Mark Reynolds could see the frustration and hurt in her eyes, but what confused him the most was the certainty in her voice. She was not asking questions anymore. She was making accusations. Sarah claimed that Mark had been cheating on her. She said the messages she had been receiving for weeks proved it. According to those messages, Mark had been meeting another woman after work, lying about where he was going, and hiding the truth every time Sarah tried to confront him. Mark stared at her in disbelief. The accusations felt completely disconnected from reality. He had never been unfaithful to Sarah, not once during their relationship. From the moment they met in that quiet coffee shop years earlier, he had believed she was the person he wanted to build his life with. Hearing her speak as if all of that trust had disappeared felt like watching something fragile break in slow motion. He tried to remain calm as he asked her where the messages had come from and why she believed them. Sarah showed him the screen again, pointing to screenshots that appeared to contain conversations from a number claiming to be connected to someone who knew about Mark's supposed behavior. The screenshots looked convincing at first glance. They described specific evenings when Mark had worked late, claiming he had actually been meeting someone else instead. Some of the messages even mentioned places Mark recognized from his daily routine around the city. The level of detail made it difficult for Sarah to dismiss the accusations completely. She explained that the messages had started weeks earlier and that she had ignored the first few, assuming they were random lies sent by someone with nothing better to do. But when more messages arrived, each one including additional details about Mark's schedule, her doubts slowly grew stronger. She said the messages seemed too precise to be random guesses. Mark insisted that none of it was true. He explained again that he had never cheated on her and that the entire situation made no sense. As he looked closer at the screenshots, something else became clear to him. The messages were written as if the sender wanted Sarah to believe they knew Mark personally. The tone of the messages suggested familiarity with his habits and routines. Whoever sent them seemed to understand exactly how to make the accusations sound believable. Mark tried to explain this to Sarah, telling her that someone must be deliberately trying to destroy their relationship. But in that moment, the explanation felt too complicated for someone who was already emotionally overwhelmed. The tension between them continued growing as the days passed. Every new message made it harder for Sarah to ignore the possibility that something was wrong. Mark began checking his own phone records and work schedules, trying to find any clue that might explain who was responsible for the messages. But the evidence always pointed in the same confusing direction. The number sending the messages remained anonymous, and the details it included made the accusations feel disturbingly realistic. Mark found himself trying to defend his innocence in conversations that left him exhausted and frustrated. No matter how many times he insisted the messages were lies, Sarah struggled to let go of the doubt that had taken root in her mind. Soon the arguments between them became louder and more frequent. What once had been calm discussions about their future turned into emotional confrontations filled with frustration and disbelief. Sarah demanded answers that Mark could not provide because he did not know who was sending the messages or why they were doing it. Mark tried to reassure her that the truth would eventually come out, but his words sounded less convincing each time the phone buzzed with another notification. Slowly their home began to feel less like a place of comfort and more like a space filled with suspicion and tension. Even the moments when they attempted to act normal felt strained. They still sat together at the dinner table some evenings, but the conversations were short and awkward. The silence between them carried questions neither of them knew how to answer. Mark started working longer hours simply to avoid the tension waiting for him at home. Sarah spent more time alone in the bedroom scrolling through the messages again, searching for clues that might confirm or disprove what she feared. The trust that once defined their relationship was fading day by day, replaced by uncertainty neither of them had expected to face so soon after their wedding. The breaking point arrived late one evening after Mark returned home from work. He walked into the house expecting another difficult conversation, but the atmosphere felt different immediately. Sarah was sitting quietly on the couch with a small suitcase beside her. The sight stopped Mark in the doorway. He asked what was happening, but Sarah's answer came slowly, as if she had spent hours rehearsing the words in her mind. She told him she could not live with the doubt anymore. She said the messages had convinced her that something in their marriage had already been broken beyond repair. Mark tried to stop her from leaving, insisting again that the accusations were lies, but Sarah's decision had already been made. That night Sarah Carter walked out of the house they had once filled with laughter and plans for the future. Mark watched her leave, feeling a mixture of disbelief and helplessness that he could not fully describe. He believed the separation would only be temporary. In his mind, once the truth about the messages came to light, Sarah would realize that someone had manipulated the situation and they would find a way to rebuild what they had lost. But reality moved faster than he expected. Within weeks, Sarah filed for divorce. The official documents arrived at Mark's door one afternoon while he was still trying to understand how his life had changed so quickly. Seeing his marriage reduced to legal paperwork felt like the final confirmation that everything he had hoped to repair might already be gone. Mark struggled to process the loss. Friends asked what had happened, but he found it difficult to explain a situation that still made little sense even to him. Some people quietly assumed the accusations must have been true, while others simply avoided the topic altogether. The loneliness that followed was heavier than he had imagined. The house that once felt like a place full of possibility now felt empty. Every room carried reminders of a life that had disappeared in a matter of weeks. Mark spent many nights sitting alone at the kitchen table wondering who had sent the messages that destroyed his marriage and why they had chosen to target him. But the most shocking part of the entire situation had not yet revealed itself. As Mark tried to navigate the aftermath of the divorce, he expected at least one person to stand firmly beside him. For most of his life, Daniel Carter had been the person Mark trusted more than anyone else. Daniel had known him since childhood and understood his character better than almost anyone. Mark believed that when Daniel heard what had happened, he would immediately recognize that something was wrong with the accusations. But when the moment finally came and Daniel spoke about the situation, his reaction left Mark stunned. Instead of defending him, Daniel Carter sided with Sarah. And in that moment, Mark began to realize that the collapse of his marriage might be connected to something far more complicated than anonymous messages alone. For months after Sarah Carter filed for divorce, Mark Reynolds felt as though the life he had carefully built had collapsed in a matter of weeks. The house that once held laughter, dinner conversations, and weekend gatherings suddenly felt unfamiliar. Every room carried reminders of what had been lost. The living room still held the couch where Mark and Sarah used to watch movies late into the night. The kitchen table where they once talked about their future now sat mostly unused, except for the nights when Mark found himself sitting there alone trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Silence filled the house in a way he had never experienced before. It was the kind of quiet that made every thought feel heavier. The legal process that followed the separation only made the situation more real. Mark sat in courtrooms listening to lawyers discuss his marriage as if it were a case file rather than years of shared experiences. Papers were reviewed, statements were read, and decisions were made in language that sounded distant and formal. Sarah rarely looked at him during those hearings. When she did, the expression on her face carried the same mixture of disappointment and anger that had defined their final argument. Mark wanted to explain again that the accusations against him were not true, but the divorce process had already moved beyond those conversations. The court was focused on finalizing the separation rather than reopening the emotional wounds that led to it. Outside the courtroom, life continued moving forward for everyone else. Friends who once visited the house regularly began keeping their distance. Some did not know what to say. Others quietly believed that the accusations Sarah had received might have been true. Rumors spread quickly in social circles, especially when no clear explanation existed. Mark noticed how certain people avoided the topic entirely when he saw them in public. Conversations became shorter, and invitations to gatherings slowly disappeared. It was not that people openly turned against him, but the uncertainty surrounding his divorce created a quiet distance that was difficult to ignore. During that time, Mark expected one person to remain firmly on his side. For most of his life, Daniel Carter had been the friend who stood beside him through every major moment. Mark believed Daniel would understand his character better than anyone else and recognized that the accusations did not match the person he had known since childhood. At first, Daniel did offer words of support, telling Mark he was sorry that the marriage had ended the way it did. But something about Daniel's behavior soon began to feel different. The conversations between them became less frequent, and Daniel seemed hesitant whenever Mark tried to talk about the messages that had destroyed his marriage. Instead of analyzing the situation the way Mark expected, Daniel often changed the subject or suggested that sometimes relationships simply fall apart. For several months, Mark believed his life had simply fallen apart due to circumstances he could not control. He tried focusing on work, hoping that staying busy would make the pain easier to manage. Long days at the construction office kept his mind occupied, but the questions waiting at home never completely disappeared. Every once in a while, he found himself thinking about the anonymous messages again, wondering who could have known so much about his schedule and personal life. The mystery remained unresolved, and that uncertainty made it difficult for him to move on completely. Then one evening something happened that changed the direction of his thinking. Mark was meeting a mutual friend for coffee, someone who had known both him and Daniel for several years. They talked casually about work and everyday life before the conversation slowly shifted toward the divorce. The friend hesitated for a moment before mentioning something that seemed almost like an afterthought. He looked at Mark and said quietly, "You know Daniel and Sarah talk a lot, right?" The comment caught Mark completely off guard. At first he assumed the friend was referring to occasional conversations between them, which would not have been unusual given their shared history. But the way the comment was delivered suggested something more frequent. Mark asked what he meant, and the friend explained that he had seen Daniel and Sarah together several times in recent weeks. According to him, they had been meeting for coffee and spending time talking at places where mutual friends occasionally gathered. The friend assumed Mark already knew about it, but the confusion on Mark's face made it clear that he did not. Mark left that conversation with a new set of questions forming in his mind. Daniel and Sarah had known each other for years, so occasional contact did not seem strange. Still, the idea that they were spending time together regularly without mentioning it to him felt unusual. Mark tried to dismiss the thought at first. He told himself that Daniel might simply be helping Sarah through a difficult time. After all, the divorce had been painful for both of them, and Daniel had always been someone who supported his friends during difficult moments. It seemed possible that Daniel was simply offering comfort to someone who had once been part of Mark's life as well. But as the weeks passed, Mark began noticing small details that made the situation harder to ignore. Daniel no longer spoke openly about his schedule the way he used to. When Mark asked what he had been doing lately, the answers were vague and brief. There were also moments when Mark heard about Daniel being in places that matched the locations where Sarah was known to spend time. None of these details proved anything on their own, but together they created a quiet feeling that something unusual was happening. At first Mark assumed Daniel was simply trying to remain neutral between both sides of the divorce. Perhaps he felt caught in the middle and did not want to upset either of them. Mark tried to respect that possibility, even though it left him feeling increasingly isolated. He continued focusing on work and personal responsibilities, hoping that eventually the entire situation would fade into the past. Then one afternoon, while cleaning out a storage drawer in the house, Mark discovered something he had forgotten existed. It was an old phone he had used years earlier before upgrading to a newer device. The phone had been sitting unused for a long time, buried among cables and old paperwork. Mark picked it up out of curiosity and decided to charge it, partly because he wondered whether any old contacts or photos might still be stored on it. When the screen finally lit up, the device loaded several old applications and message threads that had not been accessed in years. As Mark scrolled through the phone's contents, one particular folder caught his attention. It contained archived messages from unknown numbers, messages that looked disturbingly similar to the ones Sarah had shown him months earlier during their arguments. His curiosity quickly turned into alarm as he opened the thread and began reading through them. The language, the accusations, and even the timing of the messages matched the pattern that had destroyed his marriage. Someone had been sending those same anonymous messages from this number long before Mark realized what was happening. Mark felt a wave of disbelief as he continued reading. The messages included references to his schedule, his work hours, and specific places he visited regularly around the city. Whoever wrote them clearly understood his routine well enough to make every accusation sound believable. The discovery confirmed something Mark had suspected from the beginning. Someone had deliberately created those messages to make Sarah doubt him. The person behind them had carefully constructed a narrative that made it appear as though Mark was hiding an affair. But the most disturbing part of the discovery appeared when Mark checked the number attached to the messages. The number was not random. It was connected to someone he recognized immediately. The moment he realized whose number it was, the entire mystery began to take on a new and deeply unsettling meaning. Because the number attached to those messages belonged to someone Mark Reynolds had trusted for most of his life. Mark Reynolds stared at the phone screen for several minutes without moving. The number attached to the messages was familiar, painfully familiar, but his mind refused to accept the possibility that was beginning to form. At first he convinced himself there must be some mistake. Phone numbers can be reassigned, devices can be borrowed, and people can appear connected to things they had nothing to do with. That explanation felt far easier to accept than the alternative. Still, the feeling in his chest told him he could not ignore what he had just discovered. So Mark did something he had never imagined he would need to do. He began tracing the number. He started with the simplest method available. He compared the number stored in the phone with the contacts saved on his current device. The result appeared instantly, and it confirmed what he already feared. The number matched the one belonging to Daniel Carter. For a moment Mark felt as if the room around him had gone silent. The possibility that had once seemed impossible was now staring directly back at him from the screen. The messages that had destroyed his marriage, the accusations that had slowly turned Sarah against him, the lies that had filled their home with tension had all been sent from Daniel's number. Mark tried to convince himself that there must be another explanation. Perhaps someone else had used Daniel's phone without his knowledge. Perhaps the messages had been forwarded through a system that disguised their origin. But as he continued looking through the archived conversation, the evidence became harder to dismiss. The pattern of the messages showed careful timing, often arriving during moments when Mark was busy at work or unable to respond quickly to Sarah's concerns. Whoever wrote them understood exactly when to send information that would appear convincing. And whoever wrote them had detailed knowledge about Mark's daily routine. The realization slowly settled in. The messages were not random attacks from a stranger. They were part of a plan created by someone who knew Mark extremely well. Someone who had watched his life closely enough to turn ordinary details into convincing accusations. Someone who had been close enough to both Mark and Sarah to manipulate the trust between them. The truth that followed was almost impossible for Mark to accept. The messages that destroyed his marriage were coming from Daniel Carter. For several days Mark kept the discovery to himself while he tried to understand what it meant. He revisited old conversations, replaying moments from the past that had once seemed harmless. The dinner parties, the weekends watching football, the evenings when Daniel stopped by the house unexpectedly. At the time those visits had felt like simple gestures of friendship. Now Mark wondered whether something else had been happening during those same moments. The more he thought about it, the clearer one disturbing possibility became. Daniel had been close enough to observe everything about their marriage. He knew when Mark worked late. He knew when Sarah felt lonely or frustrated. He knew the small tensions that sometimes appear in any relationship. All of that information could have been used to build the messages that slowly destroyed the trust between them. Mark decided he needed to learn more before confronting anyone. Quietly, he began piecing together a timeline of events. He compared the dates of the anonymous messages with moments he remembered from the final months of his marriage. The pattern revealed something unsettling. Many of the messages arrived shortly after Daniel had visited the house or spent time with them during social gatherings. At the time, Mark had never thought twice about those visits. Now they looked like opportunities for Daniel to gather information about their lives. The deeper Mark investigated, the more connections he began to see. The accusations in the messages often referenced places Mark had mentioned casually during conversations with Daniel. Restaurants he planned to visit for work meetings. Bars where co-workers occasionally gathered after long projects. Even specific nights when Mark told Daniel he would be staying late at the office appeared in the timeline of the messages sent to Sarah. The level of detail made one thing painfully clear. Whoever created those accusations had been listening closely to Mark's life for a long time. But the question that troubled Mark most was not how Daniel had done it. The question was why. Why would a man who had been his closest friend for decades destroy his marriage so deliberately? Mark searched through old memories trying to find any moment when Daniel had shown resentment or jealousy. At first he struggled to find anything obvious. Daniel had always appeared supportive when Mark talked about Sarah. He had celebrated their engagement and stood beside him during the wedding ceremony. Everything about his behavior had suggested loyalty. Yet the evidence sitting in Mark's hands suggested something completely different. Eventually another detail from the past began to stand out. Mark remembered the early days of his relationship with Sarah, when Daniel first met her during those casual dinners and weekend gatherings. At the time Daniel had seemed friendly and welcoming. But when Mark replayed those memories carefully, he noticed subtle moments that he had once ignored. There were times when Daniel seemed unusually attentive during conversations with Sarah, asking questions about her interests and laughing at nearly everything she said. Back then, Mark interpreted those interactions as simple friendliness between two people who were getting to know each other. Now those same moments began to look different. Mark spoke quietly with a few friends who had been around during those early years. Without revealing what he had discovered, he asked whether anyone remembered how Daniel had acted when Mark first introduced Sarah to the group. One friend mentioned that Daniel had once joked about how lucky Mark was to meet someone like her. Another friend recalled a moment when Daniel seemed slightly disappointed when Mark announced that he planned to propose. None of those memories were dramatic on their own, but together they hinted at something Mark had never considered before. Slowly, a new possibility began forming in his mind. Daniel Carter may have developed feelings for Sarah Carter long before the marriage began. But Sarah had chosen Mark instead. If that possibility was true, it would explain the jealousy that Mark had never noticed and the resentment that might have grown quietly over time. For years Daniel had watched his closest friend build a life with the woman he secretly wanted for himself. And eventually that quiet jealousy might have turned into something far more dangerous. When Mark finally allowed himself to consider that explanation, the entire sequence of events started to make sense. Daniel had been present for nearly every stage of Mark and Sarah's relationship. He knew their routines, their schedules, and their habits. He understood how to plant doubt in a way that would slowly weaken the trust between them. By sending anonymous messages that appeared convincing, he created a narrative that made Sarah question Mark's loyalty. At the same time, he remained close enough to both of them to observe the damage as it unfolded. The realization forced Mark to confront a truth he had never imagined possible. Daniel Carter had not simply betrayed him in a moment of weakness. He had carefully sabotaged the marriage from within. By impersonating Mark through anonymous messages and manipulating the information Sarah received, he turned two people who once trusted each other completely into opponents in a painful conflict. While Mark and Sarah argued about accusations that were never real, Daniel positioned himself as the understanding friend who offered support during a difficult time. So Daniel did something unthinkable. He destroyed the marriage piece by piece. He manipulated both sides of the relationship until the trust between Mark and Sarah finally collapsed. He turned their conversations into arguments, their doubts into accusations, and their love into frustration. Then, once the damage was complete, he stepped into the space left behind by the broken relationship. And in the months that followed the divorce, something happened that confirmed Mark's worst fears. The same friend who had once mentioned seeing Daniel and Sarah together later revealed another detail that changed everything. Daniel Carter and Sarah Carter were no longer just talking occasionally. They had started spending time together in a way that looked very different from simple friendship. Eventually, the truth became impossible to ignore. Sarah Carter had started dating Daniel Carter. But the story did not end the moment Mark Reynolds discovered that Daniel Carter had been sending the messages. In many ways,
that discovery was only the beginning of the most painful part of the truth. Because knowing what happened and proving it were two very different things. Mark spent several days reviewing everything he had found on the old phone. He studied the messages again and again, comparing dates, reading the wording carefully, and making sure there was no possibility that he had misunderstood what he was seeing. The evidence was clear. The anonymous accusations that destroyed his marriage had been created by Daniel Carter. But before Mark confronted anyone, he knew he needed to show the truth to the one person who had believed those lies more than anyone else. Sarah Carter. The decision to contact Sarah was not easy. Their last real conversation had ended with anger, disappointment, and the finality of divorce papers. Months had passed since they had spoken calmly to each other. Still, Mark knew that if Sarah never saw the evidence, she might spend the rest of her life believing he had betrayed her. That thought bothered him more than the divorce itself. He did not expect their relationship to magically repair itself, but he wanted the truth to exist somewhere outside his own mind. So one evening Mark called her and asked if they could meet. At first Sarah hesitated. The past between them was still painful, and she was unsure what Mark wanted to say after so much time had passed. Eventually she agreed to meet him at a quiet cafe not far from where they once lived together. When Sarah arrived that evening, the atmosphere between them felt distant but not hostile. They sat across from each other in silence for a moment, both aware that the conversation ahead would reopen wounds they had tried to leave behind. Mark did not begin with accusations or anger. Instead, he calmly placed the old phone on the table and explained that he had discovered something important while cleaning his house. Sarah looked at him with confusion as he opened the message thread and slowly turned the screen toward her. At first she did not understand what she was seeing. But as she read the messages one by one, the same words that had once appeared on her own phone months earlier, her expression changed. The familiar accusations were there, the same details that had convinced her that Mark had been lying to her during their marriage. Then Mark pointed to the number attached to the messages. He explained how he had traced it, how he had confirmed where it came from, and how the timeline matched the months when their relationship had started falling apart. Sarah stared at the screen for a long time before finally speaking. Her voice was quiet when she asked the question that neither of them had wanted to say out loud. She asked whether the number really belonged to Daniel Carter. Mark nodded slowly. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument they had ever had before. For years Sarah had believed that Mark had betrayed her. The anonymous messages had seemed convincing enough to erase the trust they once shared. During the divorce she had carried anger and disappointment that felt justified by what she thought she knew. But now, sitting in that cafe reading the evidence in front of her, she began to realize that the story she believed might never have been real. The messages that had convinced her to leave her husband were not warnings from a stranger. They were deliberate lies created by someone she trusted. Someone who had stood beside them during their wedding and celebrated the beginning of their marriage. Sarah asked Mark why Daniel would do something like that. Mark explained the conclusions he had reached during his investigation. He spoke about the pattern of the messages, the way Daniel always knew where Mark would be, and the possibility that Daniel had developed feelings for her long before the marriage ended. As the explanation unfolded, Sarah slowly remembered moments from the past that suddenly looked different. She remembered conversations where Daniel had asked personal questions about her relationship with Mark. She remembered times when Daniel seemed unusually interested in their disagreements, offering comfort while subtly encouraging her doubts. Those memories had once seemed like friendly concern. Now they carried a very different meaning. The realization was devastating for Sarah. She had spent months believing she had uncovered the truth about her husband's betrayal, only to discover that the accusations had been carefully constructed lies. The man she believed had supported her during the most painful part of her life had actually created the situation that destroyed her marriage. The emotional weight of that realization was difficult to process. She sat quietly for several minutes before finally asking Mark another question. She asked whether he believed there had ever been a chance for their marriage to survive if the messages had never existed. Mark thought about the question carefully before answering. He admitted that every marriage faces challenges, but he believed they would have worked through those challenges if someone had not deliberately destroyed the trust between them. What followed was a painful but necessary conversation. Sarah eventually confronted Daniel Carter with the evidence Mark had discovered. At first, Daniel tried to deny everything, insisting that there must be some misunderstanding. But the proof was too clear to ignore. The number attached to the messages was his. The timing matched his visits and conversations with both of them, and the pattern of manipulation left little room for doubt about what had happened. As the truth became impossible to deny, Daniel's explanations slowly fell apart. The relationship that had begun forming between him and Sarah after the divorce collapsed almost immediately. The foundation of that relationship had been built on deception, and once the truth surfaced, nothing solid remained. But even after the truth came out, the damage could not simply be erased. Mark and Sarah had both spent months believing lies about each other. Words had been said during their arguments that could never be taken back. The trust that once defined their relationship had been broken in a way that neither of them fully understood until it was too late. Although they spoke again after the confrontation and acknowledged the truth of what had happened, the idea of rebuilding their marriage felt impossible. Too much time had passed, and too many painful memories were attached to the collapse of their relationship. In the end, Daniel Carter disappeared from both of their lives almost completely. The friendship that had lasted more than 2 decades ended quietly but permanently. Mark never spoke to him again. Sarah cut off contact as well after realizing how deeply she had been manipulated. The man who once stood proudly as the best man at their wedding became someone neither of them wanted to see or hear from ever again. Looking back at everything that happened, the outcome carried a heavy emotional cost for everyone involved. One man lost the marriage he believed would last a lifetime. One woman lost years of her life believing a lie about the person she once loved. And one friendship that had survived childhood, adulthood, and decades of shared history ended in betrayal so painful that it erased everything that came before it. One man lost his marriage. One woman lost years of her life. And one friendship ended in betrayal. And sometimes the hardest part of a story like this is realizing that the people who hurt us the most are often the ones we trusted the most.
Some betrayals come from enemies. Those are the betrayals people expect. They come from people who already dislike us, people who compete with us, or people who have shown us clearly that they do not wish us well. When betrayal comes from someone like that, the pain is real, but it is easier to understand. We prepare ourselves for the possibility that someone who stands against us might try to harm us. But the most dangerous betrayals rarely come from enemies. The most dangerous betrayals come from the people we trust the most. They come from the people who sit at our dinner tables, the people who know our secrets, and the people we believe would never turn against us. That is what made the story of Mark Reynolds, Sarah Carter, and Daniel Carter so painful. Mark believed his best friend would protect his life, not destroy it. Sarah believed the messages she received were warnings about the truth, not carefully designed lies meant to manipulate her emotions. And Daniel Carter used the trust both of them gave him as the perfect disguise for something neither of them ever imagined possible. For years, the three of them shared laughter, meals, conversations, and memories that seemed genuine at the time. No one looking at those moments from the outside would have guessed that the same friendship holding them together would eventually be used to pull them apart. That is the part of the story that stays with people long after they hear it. The realization that sometimes the people closest to us hold the greatest power to change our lives, for better or for worse. For Mark, the hardest part was not only losing his marriage. It was accepting that the person responsible for destroying it was someone he had trusted since childhood. Every memory of their friendship became difficult to look at the same way again. The baseball games they played as kids, the late-night conversations during their teenage years, the support Daniel showed during the hardest moments of Mark's life. All of those memories once represented loyalty and friendship. After the truth came out, they became reminders of how deeply trust can be broken when it is placed in the wrong hands. For Sarah Carter, the pain came from realizing she had believed something that was never true. She had spent months convinced that Mark Reynolds had betrayed her. She made life-changing decisions based on messages that were carefully designed to manipulate her emotions. The anger she felt, the the disappointment she carried, and the choice to walk away from her marriage all came from a story that someone else had written for her. Discovering that truth forced her to confront the reality that the person who claimed to comfort her during the divorce had actually created the situation that led to it. And for Daniel Carter, the consequences were quieter but equally permanent. The friendship that once defined his life disappeared completely. The relationship he hoped to build with Sarah collapsed once the truth surfaced. The life he imagined for himself was built on deception, and once that deception was revealed, there was nothing left to support it. In the end, he lost both the friend who trusted him most and the woman he tried to win through manipulation. Stories like this leave us with difficult questions. They remind us that trust is one of the most powerful forces in any relationship, but it is also one of the most fragile. Once it is broken, rebuilding it can be nearly impossible. That is why the story of Mark Reynolds continues to raise questions that many people struggle to answer when they hear what happened. Because if you were placed in the same situation, the choices would not be easy. If you were in Mark's position and discovered that the woman you loved had believed lies about you for months, would you find a way to forgive her? Or would the damage caused by those lies be too deep to repair? And what would you do if the person responsible for destroying your marriage was the same friend you trusted for most of your life? Would you confront them directly, walk away forever, or try to understand what drove them to make such a devastating choice? These are the kinds of questions that make stories like this so powerful. They force us to think about the people we trust and the role those people play in shaping our lives. They remind us that loyalty should never be taken for granted, and that sometimes the truth behind a broken relationship is far more complicated than it appears on the surface. So now we want to hear from you. If you were standing in Mark Reynolds' place and discovered everything he eventually uncovered, how would you react? Would you forgive Sarah Carter for believing the lies that destroyed the marriage? And what would your response be to a friend like Daniel Carter, someone who spent years pretending to support you while secretly working to tear your life apart? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective might be very different from someone else's, and conversations like these are what make stories like this even more meaningful. And if you enjoy real stories about trust, betrayal, and shocking twists that reveal how complicated human relationships can be, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next video. Every story we share explores moments where loyalty, deception, and difficult choices change people's lives in ways they never expected. Because the next story we are bringing to you is even more unsettling. It involves a family torn apart by a betrayal that no one saw coming. In that story, the person responsible was not a friend or a stranger. It was a brother, and what he stole was far more than just a marriage. Until then, remember that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the stories that make us question the people we trust the most.